Good morning, everybody. Just another little video clip, which in this wonderful age of digital algorithm control will probably be seen by probably 10 people. It's hard to think about. Back in the days in 2015 when I talked about the TPA, I used to have 135,000 people come to my page each week. I didn't even really realise at that stage, I only just started to kind of get that platform and start to think about what I was going to do with it and how I was going to shape them. Before I had it, it was gone. Never mind. That's such as life. On that note, talking about the whole issue of the digital control, it of course occurred to me that if we turn around and we switch from a cashless society to a digital control, this actually also provides an opportunity for the US to kind of retain a little bit of hegemony over the general currency system, or general credit and system. So that's another advantage, of course, because at the moment we're seeing that the Chinese and various other Middle Eastern nations are moving towards an economy system based on the petro system and the Chinese yuan. So again, that would be very useful to them. And like I said, again, where I'm basically seeing is that that's actually gone ahead. And I was quite amazed when it happened, because every time that's ever happened, something really nasty tends to happen. In other words, Libya tried to get out of the US dollar system. It got bombed into oblivion. There was talk of a similar kind of system being put in place back in 2009, where they actually went as far as the European Union, which I'll get to in a second, and looking at basically creating again a global credit system based on the euro and the Indian Mumbai minerals exchange. Pretty much, although the process of just sort of getting to the final points of discussing all that in Mumbai, when lo and behold Mumbai gets attacked by supposedly 10 Islamic terrorists. If you've ever actually looked at the actual logistics of it without just accepting what you're thrown to you by the headlines on the mainstream main newspapers, it becomes pretty quickly apparent that case was pretty 10 guys locking down all of Mumbai CBD. Anyway, so again, that would be, I said, very useful for them in that system. Then, of course, the other aspect of course, is that once everything's on digitally controlled, then you also step up the ability to control the censorship and what people are thinking. And I said, because, of course, we're moving into the situation with China and so on and so on, effectively, the US, effectively we're going to war. It's that simple. And, the US, from their viewpoint, don't have any other perspective, because they're a dying, thrashing beast empire in the last of its death roll here that still wants to retain control of the things. And so instead of just kind of accepting that, they blew their opportunity to be the world power of the 21st century, they are going to go kicking and screaming and dragging anybody they can with them. So again, it beholds them to, in those ages of desperation, to try and do what all tyrants do when they're struggling, which is to try and impose more control. So again, that moves in also towards the whole idea of the concept of things like hate speech. Of course, how do you do that? Well, you probably need something that's going to be so horrific that it'll get people just going by the gut instinct, not thinking intellectually about the consequences of what they're doing, and just allowing the government to go ahead with it. Which brings us back to the really horribly subject I hate to talk about, which is Posey Parker and so on. I don't care. I really don't care. I think the people that I think she is like all these zealots and extremists. She's there to stir the pot, to get people thinking, ironically enough, down below and up above the intellectualism. Whenever you get, the fact is, psychologically, as I said beforehand, you get afraid, you constrict up, the oxygen literally doesn't go to your head, and you're thinking in the primal part of your brain, the flight or fight part. You're not thinking in the adult part, which sort of thinks about the long-term consequences, thinks about going, well, sometimes we've got to sort of accept a bit of give and take. And this is what all this is, all this is about. So I look at the people who don't want her to speak, and I think they're just a bunch of rabid dogs, like literally, I don't care who you are. Let them, you don't have to listen. Like what someone says, walk away. It's that simple. But democracy is actually a messy creature, and you actually have to let other people speak. Obviously, for the people that do want her to speak, and their idea is that she's standing up for the rights of women and all those children. Think about the children. Oh no, not the children. Which always reminds me of the picture, of course, that convicted Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma bombing, which was of the firefighter carrying out a small child. And at the end of the day, that story was rammed so many times that Timothy McVeigh never got a fair trial because basically he got tried by the media, and all the media was allowed you to see was the children. No, not the children. So that's what I think is going to happen is that pretty much if something horrific is going to happen, and it's going to be affiliated to that topic. And as we're going into an election year, of course, we're again they're looking at the situations that right up until that time, leading up to the election, the Five Eyes system, I think it's Operation Guardian. Don't quote me on that, but I know it's a major Tier 3 National Emergency Management Agency exercise is due to take place just before the elections. Just before the elections. Just before the elections. And one of the things it's going to be actually commenting on is the idea of combating an incident that orientated around disinformation. So this is a script that's been being prepared quite some time beforehand. And of course, what's also interesting is that when you look at the coordination is that the precursor to this was actually held during the lockdown. And I had a lot of trouble trying to get information on this because I'd go and do the Official Information Act and say, well, what about this exercise? Da, da, da. And they'd be like, no such exercise has been held in New Zealand, blah, 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 blah. And then finally the penny clicked because actually the exercise was a Five Eyes exercise, and it was actually at that time being held on the streets of London using New Zealand scientists and New Zealand technology to effectively carry out this sort of door-to-door search. So, again, the bits click in, the technology that the required moves forward. We also, during lockdown, was the Singapore plane diverted to Ohakea, and no one could ever work out why. And we all thought something was odd about it, but we could never quite pin our thumbs on what was happening. But we now discover under Chris Hipkins is revealing it because it's been leaked already, and so they're trying to do the damage control. So, we're just trying to be interested and transparent. When in reality, the fact of the matter is they're just covering their asses. But this is to do with the data site that's been moved into Ohakea. Now, if you remember my piece that I did about the meeting that took place in Millbrook, Queenstown, or the Five Eyes meeting in 2016, one of the things I said was that this was all about implementing towards of basically digital technology and digital censorship technology and algorithms that could be ultimately used to track people around the planet, or the country around the planet. And one of the examples I pointed to that was the Palantir system, which is by Peter Thiel, who's one of the US billionaire bolt holes. As I said, the Labour government and the national government have been working very, very hard to turn New Zealand into an investment bolt hole for billionaires. So we've got all these wonderful people like John Key's mate, Julian Robinson, who again helped sell this concept. And of course, Julian Robinson's good friend, John Griffin, who owns the mansion up in Cape Kidnappers, where Jacinda was going to get married, and then funny things happened with rat tests and DJs, and it all went very, very quiet, and we never really heard anything about that. And it was just amazing. It was like one of these, the wedding of the year, and suddenly the media just lost all curiosity. Oh, no, we won't worry about that. We won't ask why that never happened. Anyway, so the Five Eyes meeting at Millbrook, Richard V. Allen, David Mace, all sorts of interesting spooks and kooks down at Millbrook. But the Palantir system would allow effectively them to control what you see on social media and what you don't. And this fits also very, very good collectively with the Singaporean system, who's, as we now realise, is that Singapore is not Five Eyes, it's actually Nine Eyes. And Japan and Singapore are kind of later members to the tier level. But Singapore was basically who were meant to have been, I don't know, it's always been very bit strange. That was another quiet one where Singapore was meant to have actually had brought their fighter wings. So we would have had foreign fighter jets operating out of Hakea at the time. That went very, very quiet. So I think it's actually back on again, and I must follow that one up. But the also thing that actually happened at Hakea was the installation of that part of the $400 billion that John Key borrowed on top of our budget, which Labour government under Jacinda Ardern signed off on, was a massive spend up on the cyber intelligence community. And again, this is all for technology, not to spy on actual overseas enemies, but to spy on you. And that was, of course, going to be the cyber suit, which was going to be actually manned by the Singaporeans, and in their quote, use the technology they use overseas, was to quote unquote create a more harmonious society, which literally means the introduction of a social credit system. So that's where I see it happening. I see it happening very, very, very quickly, because at the moment what we're seeing, the two multiple things which it should indicate to us is that we are really should be in prepping mode and expecting this to happen sooner than later. Includes the fact that in Australia, the ANZ Bank, managed over here by people like John Key and Chris Luxon of Air New Zealand. Remember, of course, you might remember 2016 when I was talking about this whole Five Eyes type situation. I also said to you back then that in the first 8 minutes of the meeting for Obama Barack, which was hosted by the same people, the American US Chambers of Commerce, and the same people behind the TPA, and it was also sponsored by the ANZ and Air New Zealand, that in the first 8 minutes of that speech, I said to him that they had put forward Chris Luxon as being the candidate to run against Jacinda Ardern in the following elections. In fact, I've often referred to this. No, we'll stick with the facts. We won't go into speculation, but that's, of course, now largely obviously been proven to be absolutely accurately, 100% correct. So the ANZ is now introducing, basically won't be accepting cash transactions anymore in Australia. This fits in very much with what's happening in Canada, where they're again rolling out the digital ID and the idea of cashless society at a freaking staggering rate. And this also ties in with the protests that are taking place in France against Macron, against them lifting up the pension, which again was also going to be working in conjunction with the lifting up of the removal of cash from society with the digital society. So this is all happening just like the exercise I was telling you about during lockdown, all within the Five Eyes countries, and it's all happening simultaneously. So again, when you look at the legislation which took place when the exercise occurred during lockdown, all within 2 weeks, the legislation required to put the bills in, not passing laws, but the preparational stages for the hate speeches, all went into all the Five Eyes countries simultaneously. Almost the wording was identical, word for word, within 2 weeks of each other. What we're now seeing here again is this is what's happening here is the coordination of these. This is all happening within Five Eyes NATO's countries, and that's a significant factor. Of course, the final other aspect, of course, of this is that the other thing driving all of this is that the exposure of things like Credit Suisse, which again, 2016, I've told you that there was something wrong with this bank, just as I said to you in 2005 that there was something wrong with Southgate Refinance 4 years before it collapsed. These things, again, I said 2016, similar red flags. I pointed specifically to Credit Suisse, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, JP Morgan, and Deutsche Bank, and there were a couple of they were the three ones I just mentioned. And they're all part of the FinCEN report. Now, the FinCEN report's quite interesting because, of course, we've got the Cameron Audit affair, but we'll leave that's the Canadian spy scandal. We'll leave that to the side. But what's more interesting, the thing I'm trying to wrap my head around at the moment, is, of course, is that the original FinCEN program, which I suddenly realised is actually in my own, the origins, I write about that in my book, State Secrets, and that's actually linked into the database system that they use, is actually linked into the creation of PROMIS tracking software, which is almost like an earlier version of Palantir, which was created by a guy called Hamilton, stolen from him, basically by the US, Alphabet Soup Brigade. In fact, no, correction. It was stolen to him by the the US intelligence Alphabet Brigade that exists off the reservation. In other words, not part of the official organisation that we normally loosely affiliate with the whole Iran-Contra affair, which of course again involves people like Richard V. Allen, the Millbrook resident who lives in Millbrook, Queenstown today. In fact, Richard actually once tried to sue me, which I'm very proud of, and got his ass kicked. And one of the fun things I always found very funny about that was he was going, "Oh, I wasn't responsible. It was an aide of a senator." Well, the aide of the senator he's actually trying to finger was Robert McFarlane, his replacement. And Robert McFarlane was actually at the time working for Senator John Tower, who went on to head the Tower Commission, which is the commission that actually exonerated the president and people like Richard V. Allen from any knowledge or involvement of the Iran-Contra affair. So in effect, John Tower was sent to investigate himself. Thanks, Richard V. Allen, you dick. Dick Allen, what a great name. But anyway, back to those guys. They stole the software from Hamilton. They used it for their own pirated purposes. And what the original purpose of the PROMIS in its original form was to do was to act as an early warning system by spotting the red flags before an economic collapse. What these guys used it for was that PROMIS had a very unique feature, but was if you installed it into certain people's software, say, for example, you sold it as an educational software to the Canterbury University, well, then it will work around any other networks that would connect to Canterbury University. It would work its way through. And if it got to a point where it could, because it was a firewall, it would just start to learn to bore its way through and crack the system eventually, just carry on like a virus. And once you had that in that system, you couldn't just listen into the system. You could, just like Palantir, you could actually alter that data and manipulate the data via the back door. So PROMIS was also again linked into systematics. Now this is where it gets interesting because the systems that the banks like the ANZ use in New Zealand are systematics. And so they're looking at basically that's what they're just actually installing right now into all of those banks that we're talking about. They're all linked into the this is the whole point about FinCEN, which I've only just the penny's only just clicked on me today, is that all of this data that's been linked to people from the FinCEN report, much of it, which in turn is linked again into the links of the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, the origins of the link. We've never worked out where the leaks came from. PROMIS, baby, that's where they got their data from. And that's what FinCEN's been working on. It's been utilizing on the systems which are also installed in our banks, which can also be used to collapse them. You can see where I'm heading with this now? So, getting back to the whole Posey Parker thing. The thing that I find, when I was at Canterbury University into my degree in political science, and I was fascinated with terrorism. Everything I did at political science, I'd go up to the lecture and say, look, can I answer that question, but from the viewpoint of terrorism? And my lecturers were very, obliging, and they let me do this. Well, that so basically became what I actually specialised in. And what you learn when you start to study anything academically is, first of all, you actually have to define what it is that you're dealing with. So, when you're looking at terrorism, we have all sorts of pictures in our minds, but basically that's the form of any form of coercion, whether it's actual or the invocation of utilising, making people afraid to actually bring about change. So that actually is what terrorism is. And this is why when I looked at 9/11, which again, to my mind, for years, people, believe it's an inside job over those nutty conspiracy theorists. Well, again, fast forward to where we are now, guys. weapons of mass destructions were never in the United States, never in Iraq. We know that they fabricated that information. We know that they fabricated the anthrax release afterwards. In fact, the smoking gun of that whole thing is that Jane's intelligence at the time, when they were still trying to pin the anthrax to Muhammad Atta, became out the story, which was rapidly repeated all around all the mainstream media, that Muhammad Atta was seen in Prague receiving anthrax from an Iraqi colonel. This was part of when they were building this narrative about Rumsfeld and Colin Powell, and everyone was going along with this. And then the Federation of American Scientists turned around and went, oops, actually the gene sequencing, this is the exact gene, like the fingerprint of the anthrax that's turned up in the United States post 9/11, traces back to Fort Detrick's United States of America. And suddenly everyone went, ooh, rather embarrassing, and the story sunk from the headlines, and it got sillier and absurd, and we never actually heard it anymore. But if we went back to the original origins of that story, here we have Jane's quoting the Israeli intelligence sources saying that Czechoslovakians spotted had under surveillance Muhammad Atta receiving anthrax from an Iraqi colonel. Now, if you read into the story even more carefully, you realize that actually what happens was the Czechoslovakians were tipped off to who they didn't know, but they were told that these two people was this Iraqi colonel and Muhammad Atta. And who told them? It was the Israeli intelligence. So now we actually have a case on record of the Israelis actually pointing out a person who we now know wasn't Muhammad Atta as saying this is the guy that's going to receive anthrax before the anthrax actually was released in the United States and proven not to be linked to Muhammad Atta, who in fact, on the day that he was being photographed by the Czechoslovakian police, who were told that this was Muhammad Atta by the Israeli intelligence, we discovered that Muhammad Atta was actually receiving a speeding ticket in Florida, where he was living in an apartment rented to him by the wife of the first victim of the anthrax attacks in Florida, who was a newspaper editor. And of course, that was going to be like, oh my God, the 9/11 terrorists doing anthrax as well. Think of the children. As they again provoked our, idea of provoking our terror, allowing us to pass through these laws, which have had huge impact, not just in the United States, but around the world in terms of our ability to question the intelligence agencies and even our willingness to quote the intelligence agency. More recently, there's a recent article about the change of the new SIS boss, who I still actually have to go and do my deep dive on. But what struck me about that half a page article about him was at the very end of it says, there's a new boss, the SIS boss, that's it. They don't tell you anything about his background whatsoever at all. Because now we just accept the SIS. Just all those times before when they told us that, beware of the left, and then a right-wing terrorist occurred, and they didn't tell us about Fiji, and they didn't tell us about the Rainbow Warrior, and they've been proven time and time again to actually have been not leaking, but manipulating data. A very good article in the Salient magazine of Salient Victoria University magazine, interviewing the Brigadier Gilbert Smith, the head of the SIS at that particular time, and he, in this interview by this very, very clever journalist, whoever he was, says, so we tell the Prime Minister that there's a threat. We don't always necessarily tell him exactly what the gradient of the threat is. And so when you read the implications of that article, it's basically saying there might be A1, got hard evidence photos, hardwired, thousands of witnesses, this person's going to carry out something, high quality, good, reliable sources. And then you might have an F2 or an F5 down the bottom, which is like, we heard a story in a pub by a guy telling a story about it. He'd heard it from a guy in a pub who'd heard it from a story from a guy in a pub. In other words, shit information. Probably the sort of stuff that fact checkers love. And basically demonstrated how the intelligence services actually regularly manipulate and lie to our intelligence agencies. And again, we find when you look at my book on state secrets about PROMIS, that's an interview that I do about Nikki Hager, who again confirms that none of this is about the safety of the Western world. It's about the control of the Western world. But it relies on us buying into it, and it relies on us buying into it by them stoking our fears. So when we get some little issue or some little shit stain like Posey Parker coming into New Zealand, not her country. Okay? You want to protest? Do it in your own fucking country. I mean, and that's not particularly fair. We've all got to control around this with ideas. But the point is, she is coming into an environment which is, there is nothing constructive to be had there. This is not creating an environment where you can have a good debate. And you should be able to have this debate. I get the reason why people want to debate it. I just don't like how we're going about it and how we're letting ourselves turn into these feral, just really not people to be proud of. And that doesn't matter whether you support her cause or you're against her cause. I think both sides really are just dickheads. And the result is that we're going to see something really horrific, probably relating around this issue, happen in the very, very near future. And it'll be used to push through the legislation for the hate speech, which they've been trying to push through for a very, very long time. And I bet you it'd be part of the agenda that if they could get it through before the elections, then whoever does is going to get a few more gold stars than if they have to leave it to Chris Luxon to do. Although it'd be really useful for Chris Luxon, because again, one more set of controls could allow him to, do the crackdown, which is what I believe Chris Luxon is actually going to be about. So again, we've got all these alternative media people out there at the moment that are alternative media, quotation. Good one. But they're running around and saying, stirring all this stuff up, and they're using all these social media channels. And again, it's all about we look at Cambridge Analytics with Winston Peters brought these guys in, same people that gave you Brexit. And again, Andy Gilmore turned and said, I like Brexit, but I wanted to see if I could scare the people into actually being against it. That's the fear. Again, fear. So he brought him and everyone laughed because it didn't really achieve that much result and did more for ACT. Think about that. And they, that was everyone forgot about it. Well, no, because that's not how it works. You have to do, as we see in the Hollow Men with the campaign strategy advised by Richard V. Allen and Stephen Jennings of the New Zealand Treasury Department, who's now credits Susie and part of all these groups of people. Of course, the other thing that will probably happen is the loss of KiwiSaver. That'll be, really another thing to add to the fear motion. So I'm not sure which goes worse first. We first of all had the crash and the digital crash, and then we had the really, really violent thing. But between those two events, that's the cumulative ability to get the hate speech moved across the boundaries. So yeah, that's pretty much how I kind of see that one rolling. But the idea that we see with all these ideas of these particular, extreme movements, is they're designed, the social engineering behind that, same with Cambridge Analytics, that was done before, so you can do your recon. So, Winston Peters comes in, and Cambridge Analytics comes in, and they're looking at all these different websites, and they've already brought in people like the guy that was behind MediaWorks and affiliated, like there was this guy in Queenstown, not too far down the road from Peter Thiel, and basically had hundreds of domain names, and he would just turn around in any story like that I came up with, he would jump on and then turn it into Seven Oceans and use all the stuff to get his sillier version, drowning out my independent journalism version. So you basically don't even, I'm probably talking to a room full of 10 people and their dog called Colin right now, but we do what we can. So he was operating out of Queenstown, hundreds of domain names, but he fitted a model which also very, very similar to the guys that we saw that ran the technical side of the QAnon campaign associated with people like Stephen Bannon, who of course also underwrites the platform or hosts the platform Counterspin, which involves an alternative in the media person who's getting huge volumes in the media, making sure everybody knows about him. And of course, things like everyone goes to Telegram, so they're now even a more of an echo chamber. So instead of actually reaching out there to find actual information, they've moved into this, this ambush. So they're now on a platform which makes it so much, it makes them so much more predictable and so much more easy to control. And they think that they're got privacy, and that this way Big Brother can't listen on you. Oh, silly people. Remember I told you again about PROMIS? We'll just go fuel system. Yeah, okay, we can hear you now. That's how easy it is. But yes, so these guys were using this platform, which in their case, they were based in the Philippines, and they but were using a platform which was very similar to the one of the guy in Queenstown, but they were reaching out towards millions of people, with millions of platforms, all for fake hosting, all about basically getting out fake news. And it's quite interesting because, again, we talk about fake news and the Russians, but it's actually where we look at people like Michael Stace, who was the 2IC to the New Zealand political party, or the NCP party, which involved Billy and my former colleague Vinny, who allowed himself to be sucked down the drain and get sucked off of the direction with these guys. And he's now out of commission. And of course, Kelvin's just slotted right into his platform. We see with those particular guys that Michael Stace, who was a member of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, and specifically he is a cyber expert and specialises in information technology. So again, he's an example of these kind of Cambridge Analytics people that we're now seeing running around our political environment and lead up to the elections, while Five Eyes is about to protect us from disinformation, more like spread the disinformation, all about creating, because that, of course, that ability to create a harmonious platform technically also allows you to create an unharmonious platform. And it's sort of interesting because if you look at all the main incidents that we look at, for example, in terms of the July bombing, the 9/11 bombing, and even the events in Beslan, which, you know, adds another interesting aspect. My basic belief is that you have a cadre of multinational intelligence services, and they actually aren't necessarily CIA, KGB, they're both. And then outside of that, and they're doing their own thing. They're like the other private sector, if you want. And then you have the people on the other side who think that they're actually, you know, CIA, KGB, and they're the official one, but then you've got the sort of private body around them, you know, doing whatever you want. So when you look at Beslan, it's the same deal. But the point I was actually getting to there was in all these exercises, what you had was or not exercises, terrorist attacks, you had a correlating exercise happening just beforehand. And the function of that is that basically the idea of running an actual exercise along with a fake exercise at the same time means that if anyone's actually ends up listening in and they hear data or reference, then they can say, oh, no, that was just the exercise, that wasn't real. And it's just a way of a security blanket to basically provide cover as you move your own people and your own assets into that area, which is pretty much what we see with the Singapore and the lead up to this exercise, and plus with what, you know, Kripkins has just been saying about what's happening in Oaxaca, we are seeing this large transfer of data. Interesting enough, again, Oaxaca and Ardmore, we are also seeing private planes flying in there on a regular basis, sort of doing all the main mapping and digital surveying as part of this, involving near maps, which all went down during lockdown, very private, very secretive, happening all around the world. Again, not a lot of real interest in the media about this mass exercise, which was effectively linking something which would require huge fucking number crunching to do all of that stuff. I mean, we're talking quantum computing on a staggering level. We've got the film clip of these planes flying in there completely with stuff in their planes, but though that was the same ports that were also being used for planes, Learjets that were flying in, that we were tracing back to the Bank of Utah and the Bank of Wells Fargo. Remember, the Bank of Wells Fargo links into New Zealand First National Bank, but it also links into the Wachovia links into Wachovia, which was also the bank that's been used by these shady Iran-Contra types to launch huge amounts of Russian cash made from the sale of public assets from Russia, moved via Credit Suisse, JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. So again, basically what I'm saying is that we're seeing the hard physical assets of that same network we know are actually operating out of those military bases right now. We've got the flight trackers and the photographs and the serial numbers of those airplanes, which can all confirm that as an actual fact. Not that you'll hear, of course, mentioned earlier on counterintelligence, not counterintelligence, well, that's a Freudian slip, isn't it? On the countersync platform, who are busily selling you Israeli Bitcoin. At the same time that we discover that the Israelis that got kicked out of the country were here to spy on behalf of New Zealand immigration. And guess what? New Zealand immigration's using systematics from PROMIS. You're starting to see where I'm getting from this? And again, we can actually link that right backwards. We can actually link that back to COVID, the people that actually distributed COVID. Or let me put it another way. COVID turned up again before Wuhan. And this is again a story that alternative media now won't follow, and they've actually been very, very carefully set up on this one too. The epidemiology of COVID didn't actually take place in China. We can trace it back to NATO countries, including definitely Spain, Italy, Austria, I think France. We also had the incident in July of 2019 where the Green Hills facility, retirement home for retired military vets. In fact, there were three. I've just got to recorrect that. There were three homes. Green Spring was one of them. One of them was definitely for retired vets and for families of vets, but they were all within an area that had a large military vet population. And they started to get a strange mystery respiratory disease, which was coinciding at the same time that bases within that Virginia Quantico area, which includes the anthrax facility, also the Fort Detrick facility that was linked to the fake anthrax attack, all started getting this respiratory. They started getting black respiratory, which is actually a secondary condition to the symptoms that we normally associate with COVID. Actually, SARS appears. We know that at that time that the military facilities were involved with US aid and EcoHealth in distributing vaccines to African nations linked to a host of various diseases that were being prepared at that particular base. And they were being done in a large amounts because there had actually been a previous hack, which meant that Merck was having to play catch up. And this was all being done in these bases and being done very, very rapidly with very, very shoddy quality controls. And so these guys at Springfield again immersed this mysterious disease which killed quite a few of them. And then if you follow that story, that green spill just moved straight into being COVID. And no one ever turned around and said, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, then that means that COVID started in America. And again, the first subject we have, a subject zero in the United States of America, was a US soldier, again in the same Virginia area, and everyone always actually associated that particular person with being in China from what they assumed was the Chinese military games. But if you look at the local newspapers and the designation, which was, I think it was actually military, like a paper on a base or something like that, but they use the terminology which implies that this guy has been stationed at a US base overseas. So he wasn't in China, he was somewhere at a US base. I'm guessing, looking at what the preparatory movements and the shutdown of facilities and infrastructure that have been moved in quite some time beforehand, we're looking at San Diego Garcia, which is the preparational point for vaccines and aid care to Africa, which is by, I think it's Southcom, African US Command. These are the same people that were carrying out the research for vaccine against diseases in Africa via US-funded Tulane University, where it was carried out in countries where the ground zero would actually be where vaccinations had been trialled at the World Health Organization facilities, with basically each of the victims linked straight back to hospital. There's this whole idea, just like China, that this was bat soup. They have never provided you one single shred. And we actually find out the origins of the bat soup in the Ebola case in 2014 was Peter Daszak of EcoHealth, the same guy that planted the story about the bats in Wuhan. Small world, huh? Also using COVID tracking technology, trialing tracking technology, which didn't work back then, actually got EcoHealth actually sacked. We now see that technology being trialed in New Zealand. Actually turns out that it's actually linked back to Peter Thiel, so it's actually Palantir. So in actual fact, it's just basically Palantir is just PROMIS tweaked. You see, again, where I keep coming at this from you? This is all about PROMIS, baby. This is all about the octopus. And again, going back to it, what we see is the candidates that arrive in China and people that also get sick that again come out of Virginia. They go from Virginia to China, come back to the United States, but they were sick in China already. That's the key thing here. The etymology doesn't go China-US, it goes US-China. And those include the guys that were Benjamin, I can't pronounce his last name, but he was the staff driver for the director of Boeing Northrop Grumman, aka General James Jones, the former National Security Advisor under Obama, who links into things like DynCorp and a whole bunch of these private military spectrums that cross borders, including out to NATO. The guy that's been largely driving the whole idea that we need AI and we need 5G because we need these really powerful automated systems to be able to control the people so that we can defeat China. At least that's the story he sold to Congress. And that's basically the same actual private intelligence networks that we link right back to the PROMIS scandal and the Iran-Contra affair. So basically what we're witnessing, and these, again, when you link all these guys back, they all link back to Lockheed Martin, all these military-industrial complex companies. So basically what we're witnessing is the preparatory stages for an attempted coup of our Western Five Eyes nations by basically crypto fascists. And again, that works in quite well because, of course, that same kind of group of people have largely driven through the things like, the Blink 128, the guy that turned around and said to Hillary Clinton, well, hey, man, why don't you back my idea to, basically sell kids the idea at Europe that our military projects are actually UFOs, and then we can steer that to kids and we can use that to actually nudge the votes that you actually want to, get in the certain states that you want, using, again, Cambridge, algorithm technology to feed the story and monitor and see how its effect was. That again goes back to the whole Storm Area 51. Well, that was just again a testing to see what platforms use, what kids use, how they interact. Again, just another dry run, just like Winston Peters' Cambridge Analytics guys in 2020 with a dry run for the 2023. And so Blink was saying, well, we'll turn around and see this idea, and they can all think it's aliens, when in actual fact it's just military technology. And that was, of course, in the WikiLeaks emails. Basically, I think it's the story is he's pitched that to Podesta. That's right, did too. And of course, they go, oh, Podesta, the Clintons, yeah, sure, guys, but don't forget Podesta's brother is Tony is working for the Republicans. So they're working both sides of the street here, which is, again, what Julian Assange was telling us about the military-industrial complex and the deep state, which was the key point about when he talked about the deep state. Who in the deep state was doing this? And everyone started talking, and everyone started paying attention, everyone started looking at it. And then, bam, up pumped Donald Trump, linked into the same bank accounts, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, and specifically the New York branches, which were also involved with hosting the Clinton Global Initiative, which was just basically a slush fund, which also involved the same banks that were basically laundering money for the Mexicans and Russian cartels, which we can now link back to the people that stole PROMIS and the whole Iran drug affair, which has all now been exposed. And that's not just people saying this. This is, you now have enough information that you can track where the CIA money, drug money, went to which bank account. Ironically, this is from the data collected by PROMIS. They're like, live by the sword, die by the sword, baby. We still don't know who leaked that information, but we do know now, we can say where it came from, because it was already in my fucking book. It only took me 15 years to remember. But yeah, the whole point, of course, is that we are now seeing that this has all been exposed, and I said it's not just the people like Danny Casolaro, Les Coleman, who else wrote about the octopus, even lampooned very wonderfully in the reboot of Spectre under the James Bond franchise series, but. Gary Webb of Dark Alliance. So these guys all turn around and said all this stuff, but the problem with them is that while they had some really good correlative information, the CIA could always just go away, you've got no hard actual evidence. Well, now, because of all of these leaks and related things like the Winebox inquiry, which actually gives us, hard primary documentation, we can identify the aircraft. We can identify which Pacific Airlines, we can identify which pilots, we can identify which hedge funds. We can fucking nail their asses to the wall. So it behooves them, it's getting faster and faster, that, they're on a time frame, because if they don't pull this off, they're all going to get fucking lined up against the wall and fucking done for high treason, and rightfully so. So, the problem with these guys is that as they get closer and closer to actually achieving their aims of a crypto-fascist republic, or crypto-techno-fascist republic, the more and more they get ready to expose themselves, or they risk of exposing themselves. So and then it gets more and more dangerous, because they know that they don't pull this off. things are going to, so now this is the time when bodies start turning up and, suicide, where he was shot twice in the back of the head, but we believe it was, suicide. And it's like, oh, I gotta pull myself going. These sort of, stabbed 14 times, which we all saw around the whole body count of the Clintons, which again, when you look at that story, I was just, as a caveat, was a lot of that stuff was actually driven by the Mellon and rival candidates of the Clinton administration. Regardless, once you strip that bare, there's still enough material in that to actually indicate that there was something seriously wrong going on within the Clinton administration. And I largely believe that was because the Clintons were, if not actual intelligence operatives, they were US intelligence assets. And the whole goal was to try and actually, part of this whole, a coup was to get their guys actually in the presidency. And this is where we'll see this wonderful swing of regressive politics, or regressive left politics, the fake left. So we see Rogernomics. Rogernomics gets born in New Zealand via the School of Chicago. All these Treasury guys embrace this idea. We start the whole process off, along with a lot of the methodologies used to capture and create monopolies around the world. So when you look at the printing, the capture of the printing industry, using the method of buying up high, asset stripping, and then sinking the companies and then making them basically go collapse. That was all trialled out here in New Zealand to begin with. At the centre of that was Caxton Printing, backed by the ANC banks. And we see again from all of these methodologies of these frauds, there is a situation, there is a template where the bad guys are actually put in there by the banks that they're allied with, who then create the shit. And then when it all falls over, the bad guys don't carry the stink. It's the legitimate creditors, or if necessarily the public, who actually bail these guys actually out. So this was, a lot of the stuff was actually trialled in New Zealand, and it was trialled under the Rogernomics period, which again, if we go back to the original Greenstone files, that was also the beginning of the trialling of the use of frequency technology. The idea to basically to have, not to make people have control your thoughts, but to impact upon your emotions. So again, you become much more susceptible to being fear and anxiety instead in a particular direction. That was 1967. They trialled that actually out in New Zealand. You can imagine how sophisticated that technology is now today. But on top of all this soft solidity technology, which includes systematics being trialled out here in New Zealand, I think it was the guy that actually... he was tied up with a guy that, it's in my book, but his plane went down over Florida, and he was trying this what would be, I guess it was a Turing system. That was what you could never get. And this is the beauty again about PROMIS. I suspect it works on the Turing, the vowel system. But this guy died in a plane crash, and his company was fucking asset stripped, and we never heard any more about it. But Systematics became San Diego Applications Independent, which is basically the people that control your Google domain names, and largely are the ones that have implemented the death of the internet, net neutrality, which is allowed to fast forward this control of the internet. So they were trialling that out in New Zealand, and economically, we were seeing the result of that was the Chicago School occult heads were implanted inside the New Zealand Treasury Department, and we also find them in place today now, places like Kiwi Bank and da-da-da. But the original guys were in New Zealand Treasury. They executed the ideology of Rogernomics, which Rogernomics was Labour, but he then go on to found the ACT Party. And then what then happened was that ideology, while the Labour government was selling you progressive social politics, anti-nuclear free, the homosexual law reform bill, which, by the way, I love. And, besides from the fact that I don't give a frick where you put your whatever, it's none of my business. I particularly love the fact, what I really love about the homosexual law reform bill was it's actually the government actually acknowledging, and it's on the record as saying that we have inalienable rights. These are rights that can't be taken away from us, which are based on the Westminster system, not the New York system. That's the UN laws and the TPPA, which all draw back to the 1958 UN Convention, which changes the definition of human rights so that they become the rights that the corporation permits you to have. And this is the battle that we're fighting all with our Five Eyes NATO countries at the moment. So this all happened at the same time in 1986. Again, the Constitution, we get the breach of the Constitutional Act, which again is the beginning of this coup d'etat, which again, no party is, I will never vote for any party that will not talk about this particular, because it was a coup d'etat, plain and simple. It was a constitution. They haven't carried out the final steps, but it was the bit that turned around and gave them the legality to do the illegal. That's the reality. Everything that follows afterwards is 1991 Bill of Rights. Well, we had a Bill of Rights. We had the Bill of Rights 1688. We didn't need another Bill of Rights. All this one did was change our definition of human rights. Just like, voices of freedom doctors, or whatever they're called, and the lot with Sue Gray, all the professionals that claim that the alternative, all they just, don't want you to vote Labour, but they want you to go this way. But they say, no, we'll fight the mandates of the Bill of Rights 1991, knowing full well that there's a declaration of inconsistency going through Parliament right now, which means that next time you have something like that happens, it won't go to the judges, which, if you're listening, judges, please bear that in mind. It'll instead be sent to a troika, based on the same model as the troika that will oversee disputes corporations in your country, two corporates against one government. But the troika again is based upon the interpretation of the human rights as based on the New York Conventions and the United Nations interpretation. So there will be. You should not be challenging anything other than on the Bill of Rights 1688, plain and simple. And of course, you'll get people like Jen, whatever her name is, and anyway, a whole bunch of these fake independent people that are saying, oh no, don't vote for them, vote for that, and all one of these platforms, which again, you've steered yourself. They've got these people steered up on this platform, so they're that much more easy to control. And when you look at who are behind those platforms, Sean Plunkett on the platform, links out that turns out it's producer of MediaWorks. Oh, yes, Checkbook Radio, and for Sean Plunkett and Rodney Hyde, the chief of MediaWorks, along with Peter Williams, who also is the chief of MediaWorks. Oh yeah, don't believe in fake media, MediaWorks, your media wars. But you are believing the same people. Anyway, so the system behind all those systems were tried out, executed by the New Zealand Treasury. Specifically, Stephen Jennings was one of them. He went off to Switzerland along with Faye Richwhite and the guys from Kensington Swansington, which then become KPMG Legal, which has involved Coliceo, which again links into the Paradise and links. Oh yeah, that's right. So basically, a whole bunch of Kiwis fucked off to Switzerland, and then they started being used. These are the people that bought on all these economic models of basically allowing us to be more under control, thinking that we're getting liberal governments when in actual fact we're getting the opposite, and doing such a good, and at the same time they sell you right-wing economics, which allows you, the corporations, to take over all your public assets, which is managed by a consortium or a cartel of wise men, which in our case is called the New Zealand Institute, headed by Stephen Jennings, used to be the New Zealand Business Roundtable, who decide on behalf of the rich people what the fair thing to do is. So it's basically modern aristocracy, So these same guys get sent off to do what they've done in New Zealand via Switzerland to Russia, and they start off with a pilot program called the Bolshevik Biscuit Company, to involve Stephen Jennings, which basically does the same thing in New Zealand, when they take the public assets, give them back to the people, but have them in such horrible economic situations that all the poor people go, well, can't do anything with this, can't eat it. So when some knight turns up offering them a crisp $100 bill and a bottle of vodka, they go, yeah, sweet, we'll have that. The corporations go, we didn't steal it. It was a fair deal. Admittedly, we set the situations up so pretty much they had no choice, which is, again, part of what we're seeing with the ANZ template models, which from New Zealand link into models which we now seen replicated by, when Credit Suisse got taken to court over their Credit Suisse, VTB, Oil, Russia, Mombasa. It was largely because they created this entire situation to deliberately bankrupt the entire, I'm trying to remember the capital of, anyway, an entire country, deliberately. We'll lend you this money, but we'll set you the situation up so you fail, which again is part of the New Zealand template, which we see executed out under the Winebox inquiry and is documented under the Winebox papers, along with various different private airlines, which replicate. Anyway, let's hang on target. So these guys turn around and did that into Russia. So now we see the full USSR, 30 years, 25 years later, and 71% of all arable land in the Ukraine is now controlled by just 10 corporations. 9 of them are subsidiaries of BlackRock, who again popped out of nowhere in 2008, largely as a result of the market being played to the advantage of the military industrial complex, largely as a result of the 9/11 event, which was basically pushed through. The money for that was pushed through the banks of Al-Taqwa in Switzerland, and again linked back to Lugano and the same networks that I've been talking about all throughout this particular video. Same people, same suspects, the same usual suspects. So those guys, and in fact, those same usual suspects were the people that Jennings or Russian mates were the Swiss bankers, Jennings and the American carpetbaggers. And the carpetbaggers, of course, ended up washing their money back through places like Wells Fargo, which is the same plane that leases the aircrafts that we now see flying out, doing all this Big Brother tracking technology throughout New Zealand and throughout the world. So again, we're now getting to the point of the game where the data, the hard data, Gary Webb and Danny Casolero, bless you boys, and I'm not religious, but comrades in arms, they suspected it, and they got some of the dots, but they didn't get the hard proof. And this is now what we're seeing. Ironically, the ironically is the leak is from data that PROMIS actually weaseled its way through as well. I mean, somebody up there, I don't know what games within games. I don't know. Maybe somebody would whistleblower. I'm too cynical these days to believe in such a thing, but somebody seriously shanked somebody else on that one. And then, of course, what we see, those banks and all those assets were laundered through the same process from Russia to banks in the Pacific, overall banks, Westpac, ANZ, BNZ, all the banks that were involved in the Winebox inquiry and similar shenanigans in Australia. Again, the ones that underwrote the Caxton printing takeoff, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, sometimes my brain goes all over the place. But the point is, we link those people back to the banks in Vanuatu, which were owned by New Zealand Australian banks, and then those banks were in turn laundered straight back into either Eastern European or borderline Central Line countries. So you had the Estonia, the Bank of Danks, Buddhist Bank, BBVA, I think, and then these guys are linked into the central Great Britain banks, Great Royal Bank of Great Scotland, or again for central banks, Liechtenstein, great central banks, and then these banks will then zing back into the rural US banks. So you get Wells Fargo, Bank of Utah, Nevada, all these states, same ones that have been used by the Mexican, Russian, or the Mexican cartels, and then these banks in turn link that money back straight into the New York banks. And that, of course, is a replication pretty much of how the Clinton slush fund was operating, and pretty much how the Mexican and Russian cartels were operating, and pretty much all like how a lot of the slush funds for any of the bipartisan bribery of both these networks or operating. So things like the Altimo Foundation, run by Mikhail Friedman, head of the VTB oil cartel, who partnered up with Credit Suisse to basically screw over African states. So, and again, that money was laundered through New Zealand. We see Andrew Pearce from Credit Suisse laundering money into the Christchurch real estate market via companies like Saunders Brown, SBR. I like to call them Right Bastards Incorporated. Very interesting people, SBR. Saunders Brown and Robinson. And again, we've got the company files and the real estate property. So we're now getting the actual hard evidence. Before we could speculate it, now we've got these bastards, and it's people like the Financial Times, amongst others in the consortium of the ICIJ, aren't stupid. And again, there are issues there because, again, when we look at the Pandora's box, that's actually the people leaking that. Again, I'm answering some of my questions as I talk to you. The same people involved with Booz Hamilton, which again links back to PROMIS. Booz Hamilton, eBay, Premier, Omea, links. Okay, so he's linking, those guys are linked back to the military industrial complex people, but they're also linking, and then Pandora's papers, at least only 1% of the data, and they're linking it selectively to take out their opposition, which is, again, gives me more, I mean, I don't claim to know everything. The more I learn, the more I ask, I just end up with more and more questions. But it's pretty clear that we're looking at a strata of society where there's, games within games, but this is the very top strata. And so the competition rivalry game, when we turn around and we look at the Winebox inquiry, which was, according to the original lawsuits, actually included George Coody, Paul McKelvey, who I've mentioned, Southern World Airlines, the CIA airline, the Winebox, again, I just mentioned that. George Coody then went off to work for TrustNet, which is the Buchalest Trust Fonseca Paradise Papers. So we see the same people basically resurfacing again and again. And pretty much, it said that data was linked from Booz Hamilton, was 1% of that data, which excludes the big four from that. So the Pandora Papers don't make any references to PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, the Deloitte's, and there's one other one which I can never remember. So they're largely excluded from the Pandora Papers. But if you actually start to look back at the Winebox inquiry, you start to realize, well, actually, no, there are a lot of the guys that actually, KPMG legal at least, through people like Paul, at least via Paul McKelvey, were at least actually steering this thing along the way. People like Professor Michael West of Sydney University are the ones that are spotting this, and it is the journalists that are actually getting this information. And it's not a perfect, because they are also talking amongst themselves and putting the dots. And so, again, how that rolls. And again, it's here with the golden rules. At the end of the day, if you don't like the moment that the journalists start to tell the stories you don't want to hear, you just pull their funding and you remove the platform. So, pretty much like me, really, digitally. Anyway, to my 10 friends that have listened to this, all I can ask you to do is go away, tell 10 other friends not to listen to this as well, and ask them to, when they're looking at things, not getting all emotional and panicky and crash sounds, on your Facebook, but to take a big deep breath, think about what carrot's being dangled in front of you, and hopefully try to get them to tell 10 other people. And that's all, at the end of the day, I can do. And probably won't have any impact. Doesn't mean I won't try, because as I used to say, that the statistical chances of you doing nothing is 0. But even when the odds are against all odds, by at least doing something, you're radically changing the odds in your favour. And at the end of the day, I do this, I can, and then I put the phone down and I go and have a nice cup of coffee and I look out at the beautiful view and I try to remind myself that, the universe still goes on and it's still a beautiful place, and all of this too will come to pass, and try not to take it personal. And I try to, as much as possible, and it's not easy because there's so many external factors. Some are self-created, some are pushed upon me, which leave me very anxiety-ridden and leave me feeling very much in my chest, feeling like that little boy, feeling really hurt and scared. And I feel really like, but I always have to kind of go, get that oxygen to my head, think about, step back, and instead of rushing in, like what they teach you when you do first aid in the army, is that the first step of first aid is to stop, look around, check the area to make sure that there are no other damages, so that you're not just simply adding to the calamity and adding to another victim, and then you go and help the person. Unfortunately, the whole psychological process behind all this stuff, and Posey Parker is part of it, whether she knows it or not. And I think, again, a lot of things is that you can be a tool. Again, when we look at the process of the QAnon process, that like we hear in the interviews, the guy says, well, what we'll do is we will do these multiple situations, and then we go on and look out for people that have either intelligence background or and it's particularly enthusiastic. And I can name half a dozen people at the time would love to be a spy, and they've rushed off and tried to create themselves careers, and in doing so, they've really put themselves in quite vulnerable spots. But you create these people, and then they go out there and they turn around and start. You teach them the basic intelligence work, and they start doing it. And then it's, again, they tell their 10 friends, and they tell their 10 friends. Except for, of course, they're all doing it with masses of deep pockets and things like the platforms, like the reality checkbook platforms. And I'm just an independent journalist saying I actually don't vote for anybody, guys. Don't. As soon as someone's telling you to vote for you, or someone you're listening to a independent media that's actually affiliated with basically a corporation like MediaWorks or the National Party, you're doomed. And again, you look at the whole situation where look about Stephen Jennings. Stephen Jennings actually wrote the foreword to ACT Party's book, and then we turn around and we look at a lot of the people that actually have moved into libertarianism in the 1990s. And libertarianism links back very much, was introduced to New Zealand in the 1970s via the carpetbaggers that ran all these shady banks in Vanuatu and so on. Literally, same people. And then they sort of stepped up the program in the 1990s, and if you get that for the Libertarian Party, who's literally using the same flag as the guys that tried to carry out a coup d'etat to set up a shady money laundering bank in Vanuatu, little torch, the illumination. We're going to illuminate you. Yeah. Oh, God. It would be funny if it wasn't true. So then these guys, of course, moved into the universities and started looking for people that are like, not actually wanting to support the National Party system, but obviously not really liberals themselves. So, but we want to be able to do whatever we want as long as it's us. And they start to create the creation of the takeover of the traditional counterculture balance, which is about counterculture is about challenging the status quo. That's why we look at all these crazy ideas. It's about saying, hey, let's turn the apple around and look at it from another view. You don't turn the apple around and go, oh, let's vote for the other side of the same coin, which is what this new libertarian version of indie media is basically doing. And I'm guessing once Chris Luxon occurs, a lot of those people that are indie media are going to get a rapid promotion. They're going to slip straight back into the mainstream, while ironically the people that have actually sold you a lot of the crap under Labour, same people, they're also the same sides of the two different coin. They're going to be out on the dog coin. Bye-bye, Duncan. Bye-bye, Tober O'Brien. Live by the neoliberal sword, die by the neoliberal sword. So pretty much, that libertarianism moved into these guys, and then of course that stepped up again during the Christchurch platform, and basically the ones that wouldn't get on the get on the whole kind of David Icke, Max Egan, Joe Rogan libertarian platform, because it's all about libertarianism. Libertarianism is the third largest political party, and it's basically underneath it all, the origins of libertarianism, or let's call it the New Republic, is this idea that you can have any freedoms you want if you can pay for it. And we find a lot of people in the libertarian movements are also very, very heavily involved with the whole ACT Party. Original candidates, or whether or not they actually branch out into things like also candidates for, again, you get people like Kelvin Alps and his party RNZ literally ripped off the constitution, basically worked up for, no, they're quite wrecked. The base, where am I going to remember that? It's the exact word. It's written down somewhere, but basically Kelvin Alps admits that his origins of his own political ideology is basically libertarianism. So again, we see basically libertarianism taking over the traditional liberal counterculture, replacing it with this, oh no, freedom as long as you're rich. That's basically what libertarian is about. It's not, age of Aquarius, or if you got a big bag of gold in your pocket, and if you're not, you're just a fucking slave. And that's pretty much what we've been sold. Fast end result is they go, oh, the Cambridge Analytics mostly worked in the favour of ACT. Well, I bet you it did, because again, when you look at what Winston Peters needs to get back into coalition, Labour and Greens aren't going to have anything with him. He needs ACT, and he needs them to be such a point where basically, minimalistically, National actually goes, well, we don't really like Winston Peters, but we've got to have it. So what we ultimately end up with is the ultimate scenario is that Winston Peters and ACT hold more votes collectively than the National Party, so that the National Party doesn't get to be the Prime Minister or necessarily. So Luxon may not necessarily be the Prime Minister, but somewhere in that mix within the top 3 positions, Winston Peters will be there. And I wouldn't be even surprised. I'm calling it now. I wouldn't be even surprised if we actually end up with a coalition where the deal is it doesn't go ahead unless Winston gets to be the Prime Minister. Now, that's so out there and so crazy. I admit it's crazy. But I don't think we're going to get a Labour Green Party. And I definitely think we're going to get a coalition party where it actually makes up New Zealand First, that they can't get the numbers all out without the number New Zealand First. And I suspect the way that things are going with the use of these libertarian parties, because the libertarian parties, remember this process is about as much about getting votes for your guys as taking votes away. So, yes, if libertarianism is actually taking the protests in Wellington, to break up the numbers of those, 40% of those numbers were traditionally Green Labour voters. So none of those guys are going to be voting for Green Labours in this this election. And the way that the protest ran was that Vinny was knocked out of the position that he would have been there otherwise, and he would have been voting votes that was largely anti-corporate and largely more the Labour Green people, because that's where Vinny first introduced the scene, because he liked to smoke his weed, and Vinny, that was all about smoking. The weed was a big part of that platform. He wasn't there, so Counterstink was there. None of the media would talk to the protesters, so the only people that was actually giving those people a voice, while in fact there were other people out there, but they couldn't get live streams. Only these checkbook reality platforms that were linked to political parties could get live streams. So think about that one for a second. All the actual independent couldn't get live streams. Only the ones that said vote for this guy or don't vote for them got it. So anyway, Vinny got knocked out. Countersink's there. Nobody will talk to the protesters. So the only platform they're actually getting is Countersink. So they've just actually basically handed the right a large check. So a lot of those guys that were traditionally Green and Labour are going to move over that way. Of course, the people that were traditionally right-wing are going to be moving towards the right. And a lot of these parties, I'm guessing like the Democracy, the NCPP, what they will largely be doing is that you will see a majority of votes that will be sufficient enough to actually take votes away from the Greens, because people are just generally fed up, or people that won't vote. But you're also going to see a lot of these smaller parties are going to take a significant, especially in tight seats where Winston's been campaigning and actively campaigning and this is about the whole groundswell ground movement, campaigning very, very carefully. It's about they will actually probably end up taking votes away from National as well, and those votes are going to either transfer through to New Zealand First or to the ACT Party. So either way, I think you're going to see a rise in New Zealand First. I don't know how much. I think it could be, I know the Cabernet guys were talking about they wanted up as far as 24 seats. We've got them polling on 7 at the moment, and I think they can probably do at least 12. But as said, as we move into election, we're going to see, quote unquote, Winston Peters talking about his use of the Cambridge Analytics people. We're going to create mischief and mayhem, which is pretty much what the Posey Parker fucking situation is all about. And of course, ACT will also be the winners in this as well, as it people get more and more moving towards those spectrums. So that's where we're at. And of course, a lot of the whole idea, again, whether some of the stuff needs to be tweaking, the thing I keep hearing all the time is this campaign called 7 Elections. I don't have any fucking hard evidence on 7 elections. All I know was the idea that it involved a cartel of people that sound very similar to Stephen Jennings, basically using technology so that they can effectively control the outcome of the elections. And this was going back all the way to 2004, when Stephen Jennings and Richard V. Allen brought the New York maker John Keane to be Prime Minister, as Helen Clark got her tune at the United Nations and supported the expansion of our economic zones and supported the TPPA. But she got a good job promotion out of it. Good on her. As she courted these guys who are running around ripping up, destroying Africa, which again linked very much to the people that Stephen Jennings doesn't be a business with, and again implicates KPMG, who is the chief rapist in charge of South Africa, and that is South Africa's economy tanking. But the idea was that the syndicate could basically control the election outcome, so basically steer the policy so that they always moved step by step towards the moral painted by Roger Douglas under the what became known as the New Zealand experiment, which, as I said, we are the crash test dummies, the beta test for a lot of stuff. And again, we see a lot of these tech companies turning up and during the lockdown in conjunction with a lot of these movers and shakers that are basically, I think, the finances behind a lot of this fake grass stuff, people that I was trying to expose during the COVID, but unfortunately up jumped the fake alternative media guys going, no, don't fake for the MMSM, listen to Checkpoint Radio, even though it's both run by MediaWorks. And they pretty much all, got their silliness going on about conspiracy, pedophiles, and all the stuff that makes all the people go, fear, stop thinking, I can't breathe, I'm going to just go punch out. Don't care what I'm punching, go punch. And so people stopped talking about what these tech companies were actually doing in New Zealand and who they're in business with and why they were putting these big, huge databases actually into New Zealand, big databases down in Southland. Now we get databases that's actually taking place in Auckland. I know there's one in Wanganui. They put the huge cables. Wanganui is where the Wanganui computer was first installed, the original, granddaddy of all the shit, which Neil Roberts, the punk rocker, tried to warn us on the beginning of 1st of May, Mayday, SOS, blew it up. And as he said, we're approaching a level of silence closely resembling stupidity. And I think Mayday is going to be a very big part of everything's moving towards Mayday. And I think, again, the actual name, Mayday, it's one of more of those things that just pushes the emotional buttons, and it fits the very, just like 911, 911, da-da-da. Again, it's the things which as soon as you say it, you can feel your body chesting because your mind's wired into that. So the psychology behind this is amazing. In that, by saying, it always amazed me that when I wrote State Secrets in the 1990s, most of the intelligence people that I dealt with were largely, of that kind of ex-army, ex-police, alpha male, very physically orientated. By the time that 9/11 occurred, and we saw, by that stage, we've got, our company, the government agency that runs our internet servers and decides whether or not, what you'll see or what you don't, is Cordia. And that had largely been taken over by corporations, largely run by corporate lobbyists. But amongst all of that, Cordia, and this Cordia actually, before it's the New Zealand Broadcasting Authority, which became the New Zealand Broadcasting Agency, which then became Cordia, Australian American accent, Cordia. But this organisation basically controlled by corporates. Inside of its cybersecurity branch, which was Aurora, was all made up of all these spooks from the Defence Intelligence Agency, US Intelligence Agency, or from MI6, that their origins were actually as online social engineers. In other words, people's ability to control what you do or don't see online, or psychologists that were specialised in finding ways to motivate people, by other words, pushing those key buttons that get you all emotional and thinking about silly issues and not keeping your eye on the ball of these real issues that really are going to impact upon you. Leave you with it. That's my little rant on PROMIS and basically how fear is going to actually drive a lot of people who know that they've been pissed on and who think that they're awake. It's basically they're not. They're just having a different dream, and they're going to be walking straight back into their slumberland because they are, it's like the whole thing about the Matrix. And I make this about, if you wanted to get to the bottom of the Christchurch shooting, we shouldn't hate the Christchurch shooter. We really need to love him, and we need to understand what kind of hurt made that kind of person, because if you understand terrorism, you understand the root thing that drives it. So I always came out of understanding that from my study of terrorism, terrorism in Northern Ireland at the peak of the bombings of the 1980s was when Ireland was at its worst economically, at the worst. It had the highest levels of child starvation. And once children started being fed, ironically, predictably, the bombings went down. And, this is the same kind of thing that we're in right now, which is we're economically in hard times, and we are It's driving us to be more scared, and that is making us not make really wise decisions. They might be smart decisions, but they're not particularly, and I mean, smart. You might have very good reasons to believe what you do, but they're not particularly wise decisions, because the outcome of buying into that means that you're not seeing the bigger picture, and you're just being gently steered and herded into, these guys have got huge pockets, and they've thought about this along a very, very long time, and it's very, very structured and compartmentalized. And yeah, it is a blueprint, and it always has been a blueprint. And anyone that says, "Oh no, that's all conspiracy," my final words are: go and check out someone else's country. Beautiful documentary, and it shows you pretty much all how the Chicago School of Economics, which in the day we're talking about a very, very small handful of people, largely implemented a model of economic totalitarianism, or the introduction of the precursors to the introduction of a libertarian orientated form of dictatorship, which is now playing out, fast forward, pretty much all around the Western world, as what was taken here in New Zealand was actually exported to the governments of Obama during the 1990s and the governments of Blair, literally involving people like Chris Hipkins, a former Shell Oil executive, and the person, and Jacinda Ardern. Hipkins was the minder, effectively, to another communications expert whose job was to push the idea of the takeover of public services by the private under the Better Business Bureau model, overseen by Sir William Sargent, who went on to do Dream Frame Stores, who basically provide all CGI for companies like Disney, owned by BlackRock, and who hosts the diversity and inclusive platform with Nikki Caro, who ran the company Mulan, which again run by Disney, which again, ironically, was also backed by the Chinese military intelligence agency. And these guys, communications, pretty much that's what his job was to do, is to sell that. Just like James Shaw from Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, also one of the guys up with JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, that have always been named again and again as being part of this rat bags, as formerly as PricewaterhouseCoopers, as formerly of Bayer Monsanto, has largely steered the Greens away from their environmental morals, so that the Greens is no longer a party actually concerned about actual grassroots values, as orientated and driven originally by its parent, the values which came out of the counterculture. Instead, it's actually driven by this libertarian model, which is like, oh yeah, we can care for the environment if you can afford it, and we'll have private islands where no poor people can go, only rich people are allowed to go, and that'll be so good for the environment. And I'll be amazed at how many friends I know who are very wealthy actually really support this idea. It's quite sickening, actually. Actually questioning my, anyway. So Greens, of course, turned around and started to move away from the idea of Rod Donald saying that actually we don't need to have 1080. It's a very bad idea to get people thinking that toxins are actually a way to solve situations, just like GMOs. Very bad idea to get them, because then they think GMOs are a good idea. And so now we get a Green Party that's silent on GMOs, and it's actually okay with using toxins, and it's brainwashed all its nice, comfortable middle-class people who want to have the luxuries and the money of drinking nice things while they're also being hippies and loving nature, and move them away from their values ideas, because they're all getting a little bit old down, and it's much easier to be a hippie when you've got a nice warm place and a 60k a year than anyway. So even the Greens have done what Vinnie Eastwood have done, which is moved away from their counterculture basis, and now they're actually falling into this whole libertarian model, which is basically also taking over US politics and taking over UK politics and effectively taking over the whole of Western European politics, so that we actually see something that on the surface is liberal, but underneath it economically is extremely right-wing, or corporate-driven. That's 1 hour and 23 minutes. I will be staggeringly amazed if any of you actually listen to this. I will probably use this video to actually go in and make some more videos of shorter ones. But this just gave me a way to capitulate what my thoughts this morning were when I woke up after dreaming about, this is not literally this dream. of Winston Peterson being the Prime Minister of the new government, with ACT being next and National being third. And I woke up going, oh God, it's only a dream. But, it said, I'm still going, no, that can't be right. But I am sort of looking at the situation going, yeah, they do want to support ACT. New Zealand First does want to support ACT because it's going to improve their rise up the food chain and actually bring National down so that they're actually all having to treat each other as equals within this corporate loving, money loving environment. Anyway, leave you to it, and may the force be with you. And go and do, once you've done this and had a cup of coffee or a cup of nice smooth Chinese tea, go and remind yourself that it's just, as my good friend Bill Hicks would say, it's just a ride. And if I had a theme tune to this, I would be playing the Blues Brothers, Everybody Needs Some Love. Because at the end of the day, if you love your enemy, none of this, they can't play any of this shit actually out on you. Because if you love your enemy, you're too busy trying to talk to them and find the common ground, as opposed to punching each other as out of fear and a lot of oxygen to the brain, you're focusing on your differences and not your commonhoods.